What would you think if you saw a man set fire to the Virgin Mary? You would see the night air over Baltimore thicken with a chemical sweetness, the smell of gasoline catching with a hungry whoosh. You would see orange light claw at the carved marble folds of her robe, turning serene white to a flickering demonic black. The sound would be a sharp crackle like ice breaking underfoot as the stone began to weep soot and surrender its form to the heat. A man set it all in motion. His name was Marcus, and he stood back in the shadows of the church garden, his face illuminated in strobing bursts by the fire he had made. He watched the flames eat the gentle curve of her hands, the placid line of her jaw, feeling nothing but the cold November wind on his skin and the hollow space inside his chest where a prayer used to live. The fire was his only answer to the silence from above. It was his final, desperate word. Marcus was a man built of straight lines and sharp angles, a life sanded down to the bare essentials. He was a black man of 46 years, with hands calloused from 2 decades of hauling refuse for the city of Baltimore, Maryland. His days started before the sun, in the cold groan of a sanitation truck, and ended long after it had set, in the profound quiet of his third-floor walk-up on East Biddle Street. The apartment was a map of his spirit. A single mattress on the floor, a hot plate on a wooden crate, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. The dust on his windowsill was thick enough to write in, but he had nothing left to say. The silence in that room was an active presence, a weight that pressed down on his shoulders the moment he crossed the threshold. It was the same silence he'd found in every church, every chapel, every moment of desperate, on-his-knees pleading. It was the silence of a phone that never rings, of a question that receives no answer. His world was drained of color, rendered in the gray tones of asphalt, brick, and an perpetually overcast sky. He moved through the city like a ghost, his solid frame passing unnoticed through the crowds on North Charles Street. He saw the world through a sheet of distorted glass, the laughter of children in the inner harbor sounding tinny and distant, the music from the bars in Fells Point, a meaningless noise. His work was a rhythm of mechanical motion: hoist the bin, pull the lever, watch the trash compress, drive to the next stop. He performed the task with a grim efficiency that left no room for thought, a self-imposed exile from the landscape of his own mind. His route sometimes took him past St. Francis Xavier Church on North Calvert Street, the first black Catholic parish in the nation. He used to know the weight of its wooden doors, the specific scent of old incense and beeswax that clung to the pews. He remembered the way the afternoon light would hit the stained glass windows, fracturing into jewels of ruby and sapphire on the polished floor. Now he only saw the cold stone of its exterior. He saw the marble statue of the Virgin in her small garden grotto, her hands open in a gesture of perpetual welcome. A welcome he no longer felt, a welcome he could no longer accept. The statue's placid expression felt like a judgment, its silent grace a mockery of the raw, screaming wound inside him. He would look at her smooth, unblemished face and feel an acidic bitterness rise in his throat. Her perpetual peace was an indictment of his own unending turmoil. The city moved around him, a river of life and sound, but Marcus was an island, weathered and worn by a storm no one else could see. His reflection in the dark windows of his truck showed a man he barely recognized, his eyes holding the flat, empty look of a house abandoned. The hospital was a universe of antiseptic white and the relentless, rhythmic beeping of machines. That is where the silence began. It was 2 years ago, inside the maze-like halls of Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. His daughter, Chloe, was 7 years old, and her laugh was the only music that had ever mattered. She had his eyes and her mother's smile, and a spirit that seemed to vibrate with a light all its own. It started with a fever that wouldn't break, a cough that settled deep in her small chest. The doctors used words he didn't understand: acute, aggressive, unresponsive. They were clinical, sterile words for the theft of his world. He spent 14 days sleeping in a hard plastic chair by her bed, his hand wrapped around her small fingers, feeling them grow colder. He watched the numbers on the monitors, praying for one to change, for a line to spike in the right direction. He prayed until his throat was raw. He knelt on the cold linoleum floor of the hospital chapel, his forehead pressed against the back of a pew, and begged. He made promises to a God he had trusted his entire life, offering up his own health, his own years, anything in exchange for hers. He promised a lifetime of service, of devotion, of whatever was asked. All he received in return was the hum of the ventilation system and the distant hollow echo of his own voice in the empty room. The day she died, the sun was shining. He remembered noticing that with a sense of profound offense. The world outside her window at Johns Hopkins Children's Center was bright and oblivious, the sky a clean, indifferent blue. The machines beside her bed fell quiet one by one, their rhythmic beeps replaced by a single, sustained tone that cut through the room, through his heart, through his faith. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a void that swallowed the light, the sound, the very air. He walked out of the hospital and left his belief behind. Somewhere in the sterile corridors between the pediatric wing and the main entrance. He went home to the apartment he and Chloe had shared, a space that was suddenly, monstrously quiet. Her small pink sneakers were by the door. A half-finished drawing of a unicorn was on the kitchen table. He gathered all of it, her clothes, her toys, her drawings, and packed them into boxes, which he stored in the back of a closet, unable to throw them away, unable to look at them. The memory was not a ghost, it was a physical tenant in his body. It lived in the permanent tightness in his chest, the dull ache behind his eyes. When he saw the statue in the garden of St. Francis Xavier, he didn't just see a figure of a holy mother. He saw a symbol of that unanswered prayer. He saw the perfect, serene mother who stood unharmed while his own child was taken. The stone figure represented every promise he believed had been broken, every plea that had been met with the same deafening, celestial silence he first heard in that hospital room. On a Tuesday night at 8:17 p.m., Marcus walked onto the grounds of St. Francis Xavier Church. The air was cold, carrying the distant scent of the harbor and the closer smell of damp earth from the small garden. He carried a red plastic can in one hand, the sloshing of the gasoline inside the only sound accompanying his heavy footsteps on the flagstone path. The church was dark, save for a single security light that cast long, distorted shadows across the lawn. He stopped before the grotto. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood on a simple stone pedestal, her marble face tilted slightly downward, her hands open. She was life-sized, carved from a single block of white Carrara marble imported from Italy decades ago, a gift from a parishioner long since passed. In the pale glow of the security light, she seemed to almost float in the darkness, an island of calm. Marcus did not hesitate. He unscrewed the cap of the can, the plastic squeaking in the quiet. He tipped it forward, and the clear, pungent liquid splashed over the statue's base, running in rivulets down the carved folds of her robe, soaking the stone. He poured it over her feet, up her torso, and finally, with a grunt of effort, splashed the last of it as high as he could, dousing her chest and face. The chemical odor was sharp, an assault on the peace of the garden. From his pocket he pulled a book of matches. His hands were steady. He struck one, the sulfur flaring to life with a hiss, a tiny, defiant star in the oppressive dark. He held it for a moment, the flame dancing, reflected in the wet sheen on the marble. An elderly woman turning the corner onto East Pleasant Street, fumbling for her house keys, stopped. Her keys slipped from her grasp and fell to the sidewalk with a sharp, metallic clatter that seemed to shatter the night's silence. She saw his silhouette against the grotto. She saw the match. Marcus tossed it. The gasoline ignited with a sudden, violent roar, a wave of heat and light that pushed him back a step. The fire was a living thing, instantly wrapping the statue in a shroud of writhing orange and yellow. The clean white marble disappeared, replaced by a flickering column of flame that reached up into the bare branches of the oak tree above. He heard the woman gasp, a sharp intake of breath from the street, but he did not turn. He just watched. He watched the serene face blacken, the delicate hands crack, the whole silent, perfect image of grace burn. The fire trucks arrived in under 10 minutes, their sirens tearing through the quiet streets of Baltimore's Mount Vernon neighborhood. By then, Marcus was gone, having melted back into the shadows from which he came. The firefighters extinguished the blaze quickly, but the damage was done. The statue was a ruin, a charred black sculpture of its former self. The marble was fractured and stained, its surface pitted and crumbling from the thermal shock. The next morning, the space was cordoned off with yellow police tape. Parishioners arriving for morning mass stopped in their tracks, their faces a mixture of confusion, hurt, and disbelief. Whispers moved through the small crowd like a cold wind. Who would do this? Why? The act was a wound on the heart of their community, a place that had stood as a sanctuary for generations. News crews arrived, their vans lining North Calvert Street, their cameras aimed at the blackened stone. Marcus watched it all from a distance, from the driver's seat of his sanitation truck as he made his morning rounds. He felt a grim, hollow satisfaction, the kind that comes after a fever breaks, leaving you exhausted and empty. But the relief was fleeting. The image of the burning statue was seared into his mind, replaying itself over and over. The roar of the flames was a constant hum in his ears. He went to a diner on North Charles Street for lunch, a place he'd been going for years. The waitress, a woman named Gloria who always saved him a corner booth, looked at him differently. She didn't meet his eye. She placed his coffee on the table and walked away without a word. He could hear people talking in the next booth, their voices low. He caught phrases. Terrible. Just terrible. And right here, in our neighborhood. He knew they weren't talking about him directly. The police had no suspects yet. But their collective sadness felt like a physical barrier, a wall of glass between him and them. He saw his own face reflected in the diner window, superimposed over the passing traffic. He saw the same exhaustion, the same deep-set lines of a grief that had curdled into something else. But now, there was a new quality in his expression. The look of a man who had not just lost something, but had actively destroyed something. The fire had not filled the void inside him. It had only scorched its edges, leaving it wider, darker, and more defined than before. He was more alone than ever. The following days were a slow descent. A tremor started in Marcus's hands, a fine, persistent shaking he couldn't control. It made it difficult to hold a coffee cup, to sign his name on a work receipt. At night, sleep offered no escape. He would close his eyes and see the fire, the orange light dancing on the stone, the serene face melting into a black mask. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding against his ribs, the smell of gasoline phantom in the air. He started missing work. He'd call in sick, the lie a sour taste in his mouth, and spend the day in his sparse apartment on East Biddle Street. The silence of the room was no longer just an absence of sound. It was an active accusation. The brick wall outside his window seemed to be closing in. He felt a constant pressure in his chest, a heavy, unmovable weight, as if the burned statue itself was sitting on his sternum. His supervisor called him. "Marcus, this is the third time this week. Everything okay?" The man's voice was laced with a genuine concern that Marcus could not accept. He mumbled something about a flu, a stomach bug, another lie. He knew he was close to being fired from the only job he'd held for his entire adult life, but he couldn't summon the will to care. The mechanics of living, waking, working, eating, felt like an enormous, pointless effort. One afternoon, he found himself walking without purpose. His feet led him through the city, past the waterfront promenades in Harbor East, through the bustling crowds of Lexington Market. The sounds and sights of a living city were alien to him. He felt like a specter, unseen and disconnected. His walk eventually brought him back toward Mount Vernon. He stood across the street from St. Francis Xavier, hidden in the shade of a building, and watched. People came and went from the church garden. They would stand before the yellow tape, their heads bowed. Someone had placed a bouquet of white roses at the foot of the cordoned-off grotto. Another had left a small handwritten card. He saw the parish priest, an elderly man named Father Michael, gently touch the charred stone base, his face a mask of sorrow. Marcus felt a surge of something hot and sharp in his gut. It wasn't the satisfaction he had sought. It was a corrosive, burning shame. He had not attacked a silent heaven. He had attacked these people, their quiet faith, their small corner of peace. The weight in his chest grew heavier. He returned to his apartment as dusk settled over Baltimore. A fever was building behind his eyes, and the tremor in his hands was worse now, a violent shudder. He collapsed onto the mattress, his body aching, the room spinning slightly around him. He lay there in the dark, adrift in a sea of his own making, a profound sickness in his soul manifesting in his bones. At 9:42 p.m., he closed his eyes, not caring if he ever opened them again. The fire had taken everything from him, and now he felt it was finally coming to consume him too. In the deepest hour of the night, Marcus was pulled from a feverish sleep not by a sound, but by its complete and total absence. The city, which was never truly quiet, had gone silent. The distant wail of a siren, the rumble of late-night traffic on I-83, the hum of the refrigerator in the apartment next door, all of it was gone. It was a silence deeper than the one in his apartment, deeper even than the one in that hospital room. It was a living, breathing stillness that filled every corner of his small world. He sat up, his body trembling, the sweat on his skin cold in the still air. And then, a scent. It started faintly, a whisper of a fragrance, and then grew until it filled the room. It was the smell of roses, not the cloying, artificial scent of an air freshener, but the rich, complex perfume of 1,000 fresh-cut roses, their petals still damp with dew. It was a smell of life, of impossible gardens, blooming here in this desolate third-floor room. He looked toward the window. The harsh orange glare of the street lamp that normally cut through his blinds was gone. In its place was a soft, gentle light, a warm and luminous glow that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was not a blinding light, but a deeply comforting one, a light that felt like a presence. It bathed the dusty room, the bare walls, the single mattress, in a serene, silver-white radiance, making the familiar space feel sacred and new. Marcus's trembling stopped. The crushing weight on his chest lifted. He could breathe deeply and fully for the first time in 2 years. Down on East Biddle Street, a woman named Mrs. Gable was walking her small dog before bed. She looked up, as she always did, to check that her neighbor Marcus's light was off, but tonight she saw the glow. She stopped on the sidewalk, her dog's leash slack in her hand. It wasn't the normal yellow light from his single bulb. It was a pure, soft, white light, so bright and yet so gentle, pouring from his window and illuminating the brick wall across the alley. She had never seen anything like it, and just then, though she knew it was impossible, she heard the distant, clear tolling of a church bell, a single, perfect note that hung in the silent night air before fading away. In his room, Marcus felt a sensation he had not felt since he was a child, sitting in his mother's lap. It was a feeling of being completely known and completely, unconditionally forgiven. There were no words, no apparitions, no grand visions. There was only the profound silence, the impossible scent of roses, and the gentle, all-encompassing light. He sat there, bathed in it, and for the first time since Chloe's death, tears began to stream down his face. They were not tears of rage or of grief, but of a release so profound, it felt as though something locked deep inside him had finally broken open. The light faded as slowly as it had appeared, and the sounds of the city returned, soft and distant at first, then back to their normal rhythm. The scent of roses lingered, a ghost of grace in the air. Marcus sat in the darkness, the tears still wet on his cheeks, the memory of the light still warm on his skin. Something had shifted, not in the world outside, but deep within the core of his being. The silence had finally been answered. The next morning, Marcus rose before dawn. The fever was gone. The tremor in his hands had ceased. He moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years, a quiet certainty guiding his actions. He did not go to work. Instead, he walked through the waking city, his steps sure and steady, leading him back to St. Francis Xavier Church. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and orange. The yellow police tape still cordoned off the grotto. The charred statue stood like a sentinel in the morning mist, a monument to his rage and pain. But now, he saw it differently. He saw not just the destruction he had wrought, but a strange, sorrowful beauty in the blackened stone. He ducked under the tape. He knelt on the cold, damp ground before the pedestal, the same ground where people had come to lay their flowers and their prayers. He reached out a hand, his fingers tracing the edge of the soot-stained base. The stone was cold and rough. He saw the bouquet of white roses, their petals now wilting slightly, that someone had left. A deep, aching contrition filled him, a feeling as powerful and purifying as the light in his room had been. He began to work. With his bare hands, he started to wipe away the soot from the base of the statue. The black powder came off on his palms, staining his skin, getting under his fingernails. It was slow, painstaking work. He focused on a small section of the pedestal, rubbing at the deep-set stains, his breath fogging in the cool morning air. He was not trying to restore the statue to its former state. He knew that was impossible. This was an act of another kind. He worked for hours. As the city came to life around him, as parishioners began to arrive for morning services, he remained on his knees, cleaning. He was a silent, focused presence in the garden. He took the wilting bouquet of roses and carefully removed the deadest blooms, arranging the remaining ones into a small, tight cluster at the Virgin's feet. He picked up a few stray pieces of trash that had blown into the grotto. Father Michael, the elderly priest, came out of the rectory. He saw Marcus on his knees, his hands black with soot. The priest had seen the security footage. He knew who this man was. He watched for a long time from a distance, his expression unreadable. He saw not a vandal, but a penitent. He saw a man engaged in a wordless prayer, a liturgy of action. The priest did not approach him. He did not call the police. He simply turned, went back inside the church, and left Marcus to his work. The community of St. Francis Xavier watched him for days. At first, there was suspicion. People would cross to the other side of the street to avoid the grotto where he worked. But Marcus never looked up, never spoke, never made a sound. He simply arrived each morning at sunrise and left each evening at sunset. His silent, tireless devotion began to change the atmosphere around the wounded space. A young woman, a volunteer who organized the parish's food pantry, was the first to act. She watched him for 2 days from the church office window. On the third morning, she walked out with a plastic bottle of water and a small bucket filled with clean rags. She placed them on the ground just inside the police tape, a few feet from where he knelt. She said nothing. Marcus paused, looked at the offering, and gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. He used the rags, cleaning with a more focused care. His quiet labor became a magnet for small acts of grace. A teenager who had been caught spraying graffiti on a nearby building a month prior was assigned community service at the parish. He saw Marcus every day. One afternoon, without being asked, the boy took a trash bag and began picking up litter from the entire church lawn, starting near the grotto and working his way out. He, too, worked in silence. Even the waitress, Gloria, from the diner on North Charles Street found her way there. She had heard from another customer who this man was, the man who had burned their statue. She came expecting to feel anger. Instead, she saw a man on his knees, his clothes and face smudged with soot, painstakingly cleaning the stone that he himself had desecrated. She stood for a long time, then went back to the diner and returned with a hot coffee in a paper cup and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, leaving it where the bottle of water had been. Father Michael saw it all. He saw the ripples of compassion spreading out from this single, quiet act of penance. He saw his parishioners responding not with judgment, but with a cautious, hesitant mercy. One evening, he finally approached Marcus as the sun was setting. He didn't ask why he had done it. He simply stood beside him and looked at the statue. Much of the soot was gone from the base, and the figure, though still scarred and blackened, had a new dignity. "The stone is broken," Father Michael said, his voice soft, "but the foundation is strong." Marcus looked up at the priest, his eyes clear, and for the first time he spoke. "I know," he said. Marcus never stopped tending to the garden. Long after the police tape was taken down and the official investigation quietly closed, he remained. The parish decided not to replace the statue. The scarred, fire-blackened Virgin became something new, not a symbol of pristine perfection, but of survival, of grace that could withstand the flame. It became a pilgrimage site for those who were hurting, for people whose faith was as fractured and stained as the marble. Marcus became its silent caretaker. He never joined the services inside the church, but his presence was a constant, quiet sermon in the garden. He planted new flowers around the grotto, sturdy, resilient perennials. He swept the flagstone path. He made sure the offerings of flowers and notes left by visitors were treated with respect. His work was his prayer, a continuous, living act of amends. He regained his job with the city. His supervisor, seeing the profound change in him, gave him a second chance. But now, his work felt different. He no longer felt like a ghost moving through Baltimore. He saw the people on his route, nodding to the regulars, sharing a brief word with the shop owners. He was reconnecting thread by thread to the world he had shut out. Years later, a story began to circulate around St. Francis Xavier. A young woman, distraught and hopeless after losing her job, came to the grotto late one night. She found a single, perfect white rose lying at the statue's base, its petals impossibly fresh. She saw it as a sign. She found the strength to try again, and soon her life turned around. Now, leaving a single white rose at the feet of the burned mother, as some had come to call her, is a tradition for those seeking hope in a dark time. They never knew who left the first rose, but Father Michael, watching from his window, would sometimes see Marcus, late in the evening after his shift, place a fresh flower at the statue's base. He was a man who had met the silence with fire, and in the ashes had found a way to speak a new language, a quiet, enduring language of service, of healing, and of a grace that could be born from a wound. An act of rage, born from unbearable pain, can feel like an ending. It can feel like the final word in a war with heaven. But sometimes, the deepest wounds are where the light gets in. The story of Marcus and the burned statue is not about the fire of destruction, but about the quiet, steady glow of redemption that can follow. It reminds us that grace often meets us not in our perfection, but in our most broken, desperate places. If this story touched you, like the video, subscribe to, and share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us your moment of unexpected grace in the comments.